Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you for the introduction. Thank you for organizing this. It's great to be here. And, it's great to talk about all the stuff that I've been seeing that's been happening on the Belt and Road, and especially talking about grassroots actors, civil society actors, communities, trade unions, and so forth that have been engaged in sort of this struggle, this contentious politics over Chinese overseas investment. I mean, I do think, the reason I wrote this piece for the People's Map of Global China is because I wanted to give more attention to this issue. I think there's been a lot of high-level analysis and discussion of the framework of the BRI and the financing and the high-level actors that are involved, but maybe not enough to these people on the ground and their agency involved in contesting the Chinese investment in a variety of different countries. This article came out from a long period of observing civil society and talking with civil society in a number of different contexts. I mean, I was fortunate to be able to participate in a number of events that got me really interested in this topic. I mean, of course, I've always been interested in civil society, for those of you who do know me, but mostly in China. But I ended up then about four years ago traveling outside of China and doing more work outside of China, following Chinese investment. I had the pleasure to go to places like Zambia. I also had another research team go to Nepal to look at Chinese investment. I spent some time at in Ivory Coast at the what's it called, African Accountability, the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability. It's a civil society coalition of African CSOs that they had a general assembly that year, and the topic of the general assembly was China. And I also had the opportunity to talk to and give presentations to civil society organizations in Asia, different parts of Asia, the Pacific, Latin America, and of course, Africa. And I also had the opportunity a few years ago to participate in a British government project called China Infrastructure Program. And the goal of that program was to raise the standards, or just try to raise the standards of Chinese companies. And I was brought in as a community consultation expert, again, to try to help Chinese companies better understand how to engage communities in the places where they have projects. And that was a really interesting experience too, because I got to work on the other side. It wasn't working with civil society, it was working with the Chinese stakeholders. It was working with the Chinese companies and the Chinese industry groups. So that was also very interesting. So I've gotten to work on, in a way, both ends of this. I mean, the Chinese stakeholder end and also the civil society end. And I'll talk more about the interactions between these two groups. Let me just share my presentation, my screen here. And I think I need to go back here. I think I was, so the presentation I'm going to give today is titled Civil Society Strategies, Pathways, and Roles in Responding to China's BRI. First start by defining terms. So what do I mean by civil society? So here I define civil society as any community of citizens in society that are linked by common interests and collective activity. It refers to a wide array of organizations, groups, and networks, community groups, NGOs, labor unions, indigenous groups, charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, professional associations, foundations, and social movements. So again, not just to think of civil society as NGOs, but much broader than that. So let me just talk about what we've been seeing in terms of civil society's response to the BRI, and I will give some cases And then I will try to sum up those cases. I'll try to provide some kind of framework for trying to understand those cases. So here's a map of where Chinese investment has gone. I mean, it's again, as many of you know, Chinese investment is many regions of the world. And this is a map of pushback against Chinese overseas investments. I mean, different kinds of pushback. So the things in the parts in the cases in orange are community organizing. The cases in blue are lawsuits, and then the cases in red are project cancellations or suspensions that were decided on by the host government. Interesting one, just want to point out, I mean, I think it may be too small to see all these cases. I probably need to expand it, but one case I just want to point out that was just in the New York Times is the Kenya standard gauge railway case. And that was very interesting because I did a lot of research for that as part of a previous project. And it was just announced that I guess the Kenyan government they were able to get hold of the agreement between the Chinese company and the Kenyan government. This was a flagship program for President Kenyatta, and it was pushed through very quickly. And now we're finding out more details about the financing, the terms of the financing, which were certainly much more favorable to China. There was also issues with procurement because in the agreement, a lot of the procurement was going to come from, a lot of the equipment and supplies were coming from China. And this was an issue of contention for Kenyans as well. That they wanted to see more equipment, more supplies like concrete, purchased from Kenyan companies. I think something like that was eventually negotiated, but I just wanted to call that out because it was recently in the news. So what do in terms of CSO responses, I mean, one way I try to understand these responses is by thinking about insider versus outsider strategies. I mean, I think both of these are happening, but they're both quite interesting. So what do I mean by insider advocacy strategies? I'm talking about working on the inside with Chinese stakeholders, through private channels usually, to try to influence them or to try to shape their behavior, their actions, their investments in the global South. And so, examples of that are, and I'll talk about these cases in more depth, but Global Witness's collaboration with Chinese industry groups to produce these responsible business guidelines. And also Mercy Corps is the another international NGO, which collaborates with Chinese state-owned companies in Africa to help them build water systems for local communities. There's also Sintao. Sintao is a Chinese consulting company that is collaborating with the Chinese industry group to produce a community engagement handbook and trainings for Chinese SOEs. And this is a project that I worked on. I was helping to help Sintao and the Chinese industry group revise their community handbook. And finally, there's another example of Green Watershed, a Chinese NGO, their advocacy in China on BRI projects. And I'll talk more about that later. Then there's this the outsider advocacy strategy. So, insiders working on the inside through inside lobbying. Outsider advocacy is again working on the outside, not engaging with Chinese stakeholders, but trying to pressure them through, for example, media campaigns, or by naming and shaming. I mean, these kinds of strategies. So, examples of that are Business and Human Rights Resource Center, their tracking of Chinese company violations, human rights violations, Inclusive Development International, their advocacy on a zinc mine in Indonesia, and I'll talk about that. Green Watershed, again, their advocacy in China on BRI projects. And last but not least, this United Mine Workers of Zambia, they're unionizing and collective bargaining in Chinese-owned mines. So those are just two different ways, I think, to think about those strategies, and we'll come back to that. So let me just talk about those cases. I mean, so, one of the first case I want to talk about is this international CSO or NGO called Global Witness. So Global Witness works in many parts of the global south on natural resource extraction. And what they did in China was really interesting. They worked with a Chinese industry group to produce these due diligence guidelines for responsible mineral supply chains. And again, these guidelines are to basically serve as a review of supply chains that reflect the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and also OECD guidance. So trying to get covering all Chinese companies in the sector, but also trying to make those companies and other stakeholders aware of international standards, international human rights standards and responsible business standards. Another guideline that was produced was a guidance for sustainable natural rubber. And this was again produced within the same industry group, and to again make Chinese stakeholders aware of international guidelines and procedures such as free, prior, informed consent for indigenous people. That that there should be meaningful consultation with indigenous groups if the project is affecting indigenous groups, a zero deforestation policy, and also highlighting community grievance mechanisms as an important part of their projects. So these were two examples. And what they wanted to do, what Global Witness wanted to do with these projects, was essentially create a Chinese-owned initiative, one that the Chinese stakeholders, the Chinese industry groups, Chinese companies would feel some sort of ownership over. They had been responsible for producing this, and in the process, raising awareness among those stakeholders about international responsible business standards. So that's one case. And you can see that this is kind of that insider strategy, right? They're working through private channels with these industry groups to basically do, it's kind of capacity building or technical assistance. Another example of an international NGO is the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. They're based in London, and they have researchers in many regions of the global south, including China. So, what they do is they track and they monitor violations, human rights and environmental violations that were reported from different companies, and then they contact those companies to get a response. So these are some of the companies that they've reached out to in the past, and this is their response rate, what they've gotten from globally in terms of companies globally that have responded. You can see over 70%. You can see that they have a more difficult time trying to get response from Chinese companies. Only about 25% of Chinese companies responded to their outreach. One case that they were involved in was this Lower Sasan 2 Dam in Cambodia. The Chinese company involved was Chinese Huaneng, and they found they gathered some complaints from communities that were affected by the building of this dam. And they referred these community complaints to the International Finance Corporation's their dispute resolution mechanism, the CAO. And we'll hear about this again, but essentially this comes into play because there was financing in this dam project from the IFC. And so therefore they could go to this, they could use this dispute resolution mechanism. However, in order for this to go through, the Cambodian provincial authorities had to approve this, and they ended up declining to participate in this dispute resolution process. But it gives you some idea of the work that the Business and Human Rights Resource Center does. And again, this kind of advocacy, I think, would definitely go under outsider advocacy. Here's an interesting example of a Chinese CSO called Green Watershed. So Green Watershed is a really well-known environmental NGO in China. Unfortunately, it recently closed down, so it's no longer in operation. But in the 2010s, it did quite a bit of work on BRI projects. And one of those was this Anning refinery, which is along the China-Myanmar pipeline. which is located outside of Kunming. And the Chinese company that was building it was Sino-Petro. So the Green Watershed, what they did is they did an investigation into the environmental impacts of this refinery, the environmental pollution and degradation that was happening in and around the refinery. They used open government information laws or regulations to request information from the local government about the refinery. And when possible, they also organized protests, especially when their demands or their requests were not being met. They also engaged in dialogue with the company and with the local government. And they were able to get the local government to carry out an administrative review of the project. So, you know, even though, I mean, at the end, they were not able to stop this project, but they were able to at least send a signal to the company that, you know, they were, the refinery was being monitored by citizens and NGOs, and they were able to push the company to meet several times with them and to adopt measures to mitigate the pollution. They were also, like I said, able to get the local government to review the project, and also called on them to punish Sino-Petro and to halt the project in 2015 because Sino-Petro had not done a more updated environmental impact assessment, an EIA. And therefore, you know, the NGO and Green Watershed claimed that this was essentially an illegal project. But unfortunately, the local government, of course, did side with the company rather than with civil society. So this is another interesting case. One of my favorite cases is this African CSO. This is a CSO that I interviewed in Zambia called the United Mine Workers Union of Zambia. And it's up in the copper belt in the north of Zambia. As you know, some of you know, Zambia, their primary export is copper. They rely on copper for a lot of their revenue. In terms of mine workers themselves, I mean, it's interesting to see that mine workers are really some of the better organized workers in Zambia. They have more bargaining power compared with workers in construction and retail. And in the Copper Belt region, there were several unions representing mine workers in Chinese mines, and United Mine Workers Union of Zambia is one of them. If anybody wants to really do a deep dive into these cases, of course, the best book on this was Qing-Quan Lee's. What is the title? Do you remember this, Daniel? It's something about global China. It has global China in there, but it's all about the copper mines in Zambia. Anyway, so what the unions have been doing is, first of all, trying to get Chinese companies to recognize unions. I mean, those of you who know the way labor works in China, there is only one official union, and it's under the Communist Party. It's the All China Federation of Trade Unions. And so, you know, Chinese companies are not usually used to dealing with unions because unions are tend to side with the company and the local authorities. So this is their first time encountering independent unions. And they were reminded that international conventions provide for the right to freedom of association, including the right to form and join trade unions, and also the right to collective bargaining. They were also reminded that Zambian labor law, the Industrial and Labor Relations Act, requires employers to enter into a recognition agreement with any union that registers at least 25 employees. Now, the Chinese company in this mine, the owner of this mine, they initially refused to recognize this particular union. They said that there were other unions that were also organizing in that mine. But then the union's lawyer wrote to tell the company they were not complying with the law. And when that happened, then the company did enter into a recognition agreement. And with that recognition agreement, the union was now able to get a seat at the bargaining table and to be involved in the collective bargaining. So this was very interesting to see that Chinese companies were engaged in collective bargaining in the Copper Belt, because I had also been working in China Labor Bulletin. I'd been working to try organizing Chinese workers to do collective bargaining in Chinese companies. It's very difficult because Chinese companies don't want to do collective bargaining for obvious reasons. There's no legal requirement for them to do that. So I think for them to do this in Zambia is maybe an indication of how they, again, they realize they need to comply with, again, host country laws. So in these collective bargaining sessions, they discussed issues such as salaries and conditions of service. They discussed anti-union activities that were violating workers' right to organize, and sometimes the companies would engage in these kinds of anti-union activities, and the union was trying to get them to stop it. They also discussed more attention to health and safety, which was a big issue. And let's see, some things just covered my present. Oh wait, I'm sorry. This is like, okay. And then also abnormal working hours. Working hours in these mines were quite long. And then unions also advised management on dangerous working conditions that could lead to accidents and strikes. In terms of the whole process of collective bargaining, the way it worked was that unions would collect proposals from their members and shop stewards. They would combine these proposals into a white paper and submit it to management, and they would set a date for the negotiations, the collective bargaining negotiations. And then negotiations would then begin. And when in the negotiations, you had the Chinese management was represented by its chair, and then you had the union side that was represented by the union that had the majority of workers. I'm saying that should be majority of workers. So because there's several unions in this particular mine, so the biggest union then would be the one that would be represented at the table, and then there would be a series of meetings to decide to come to some agreement, and the resulting collective agreement then would become law once it was approved by the ministry. So it was very interesting to see that this was happening with Chinese companies in Zambia. So that was an interesting case. And the last case I want to talk about is a case of not so much local, it's a case of, or international, it was a case of both. It was a case of an international NGO and cooperating with local NGOs and communities in response to an Indonesian zinc mine. And just to say something about the mine, it was a joint venture Indonesian and Chinese zinc mine in North Sumatra. It was surrounded by protected forests. So people were obviously worried about the environmental impacts on those forests. And also there was potential impacts on 11 villages of indigenous people who were living around the mine. Some of the concerns that were raised by the CSOs and communities were that there were catastrophic, these tailings. The tailings are the waste that ends up from the processing of the zinc. So there were these catastrophic waste tailings that they were afraid might collapse. They might affect the villages if, for example, in a period where there's too much rain, it might end up going into the village. There was also concerns about the drainage from the mine, which contained large amounts of acid. Also, the safety of explosives that were stored nearby. Obviously, the displacement of communities that were displaced by the mining activity, the lack of community consultation and consent on the part of the Chinese company, and low levels of transparency. And these issues of safety, displacement, lack of community consultation, lack of transparency, these are common complaints that we see in a lot of Chinese investment projects, as well as other foreign invested projects as well. What the international and NGO did in terms of working together with local CSOs was to build this really interesting and elaborate kind of multi-track advocacy campaign that involved a number of different levels. So they organized local advocacy, they engaged communities, they engaged the local government, they organized media campaigns in Indonesia. They did investment chain research to see other companies that might be involved either as suppliers or as buyers that also could be pressured. They engaged legal experts and engineers to testify about the safety problems. They wrote letters to the Chinese financiers, the Chinese companies, some of the Chinese ministries to make them aware of these issues. They also submitted a complaint to the IFC's, the CAO grievance mechanism that we talked about earlier. They also tried to engage downstream buyers. So the buyers of this zinc, a lot of them were these major automakers, and they tried to engage them to make them aware of the problems with the sourcing of the zinc that the automakers were getting. And they also organized an international media campaign to make the international community aware of these problems. And they also did capacity building for local CSO. So a lot of different things were going on in this particular case. So I think, that's all I want to say about those cases. I mean, I think I just described 5 of them. And I want to just kind of sum up by talking about the different pathways and the roles that civil society plays in these cases. So in terms of like pathways and mechanisms, I think, we're looking at a lot of interesting pathways and mechanisms at different levels. So at the international level, we can see some of these CSOs using like international financial institution policies and mechanisms, international treaties, investment treaties, organizing international media campaigns. And some examples of that would be Global Witness's due diligence guidelines that incorporated international standards, and also Business Human Rights Resource Center and the Indonesian CSOs, their use of the International Finance Corporation's grievance mechanism. At the national level, some of the pathways and mechanisms used were environmental and social impact assessment, labor and open government information laws, consultation with government agencies and companies, the host country government agencies, lawsuits or threats of lawsuits, and media campaigns. And so examples of this would be the Zambia trade union's reliance on national labor laws to get the Chinese company to come to the collective bargaining table. Green Watershed, their use of open government information laws to get information about the Sino-Petro project and their consultation with local governments in the region, and Global Witness's engagement with Chinese industry groups and companies. And then finally, is the lowest level is the level of community and workplace. What we're seeing is organizing and unionizing going on in the workplace or in the communities, capacity building of these community organizations to help them understand what is going on and the impacts that Chinese investment projects are having, carrying out dispute resolution or collective bargaining processes, and if necessary, organizing protests and strikes. And so examples of these community or workplace activities would be the Zambia Union's collective bargaining process, and also the advocacy on the Indonesian zinc mine through local CSO and community organizing and through local media campaigns. We can also think about the different roles that civil society played in these responses. So, and here what I have is a table looking at, advocacy targets. Who was the target of the advocacy? What was the role of the CSO? And then also what is the, what examples of those? And so we see that, monitoring, documenting, lobbying, litigating, to strengthen implementation and enforcement of environmental and social laws and standards. That was an important role of CSOs. I mean, in a number of these host countries, you had good labor laws, you had good environmental and social impact assessment laws, but they just weren't being implemented or enforced. And CSOs play an important role in monitoring and documenting and making governments aware of that. Also, with regard to Chinese companies, banks, and industry groups, CSOs play a role in terms of monitoring, documenting, and engaging companies on their impacts to make them aware of their human rights and environmental impact, to strengthen accountability to those to environmental and social laws and standards, and also to build awareness and capacity among like Chinese stakeholders, Chinese companies, banks that often don't really know how to, for example, engage with communities or set up like grievance mechanisms in their projects, to help them to align projects with international and national and international standards. Another advocacy target will be international organizations, companies, and financial institutions. And again, here you could also see CSOs doing monitoring, documenting, and lobbying to use international standards to improve social and environmental outcomes. And then finally, communities and workplaces playing a role, CSOs and communities playing a role in organizing and providing capacity building support to these communities. And so on the very right-hand side, I just have examples of all these, but I won't go through them because I just already gone through those cases. But I do want to just kind of talk a little bit about all this pushback and whether it's having any kind of effect on Chinese stakeholders, on Chinese policymakers. Is Beijing listening to any of this? And I want to say a cautious kind of yes to that question, that there does seem to be on the part of Beijing, on the part of the Chinese government, some growing attention to sustainability, to development cooperation, and to multilateralism. So I just want to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll come to the end of my talk. But in 2019, I think, we had an important statement from Xi Jinping at the Second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, where he called for a green and clean BRI. He called for a high quality, more sustainable, resilient, affordable, inclusive, and accessible infrastructure projects. And I think, they had been aware of a lot of this pushback from communities and CSOs. And to me, this is just a sign that, they were trying to send a message that, yes, they were listening and they were going to, respond to those concerns. At the September 2021, the UN General Assembly, Xi Jinping made an address where he promised that China would no longer build new coal-fired power projects and would support the development of low-carbon energy in developing countries. And then in January of 2022, Chinese ministries issued environmental protection guidelines for overseas investment projects. And they called for abiding by international or Chinese standards if host countries have inadequate standards. So they were calling for Chinese companies to abide by the higher standards. And that's something that we hadn't heard before. And especially, this call to observe international standards. They also called on Chinese companies to observe environmental protection rules and regulations in accordance with international best practices, and to actively strengthen communication with affected communities and the public. A few other sort of things that happened about the same time. So all this is happening in the last couple of years. Is a white paper that was issued in January 2021 on international development cooperation. And I think looking at this document, you can see that there was an effort to reach out to the global South to emphasize that China was interested in more development cooperation, and that China was itself a developed country, the largest developing country in the world, and had the responsibility to contribute to this, what Chinese leaders like to use this term, global community of shared future. And that international development cooperation should be aligned with South-South cooperation, with the BRI framework, and with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So, this is an indication of the value they place on sustainability and on multilateralism, multilateral platforms. And then the other example I wanted to give is in August 2021, where China pledged $100 million to the COVAX mechanism that brought their total contributions to nearly $10 billion. So I think, these are some maybe encouraging signs of emphasizing more development cooperation and sustainability and multilateralism with the Global South. So to sum up, I think I want to just conclude by saying that, what we see in the last couple of years is that the BRI has made some, I don't want to make too much of these promises or these pledges by Chinese leaders, but they've made some moves towards sustainability, towards development cooperation, towards multilateralism. And I think as that happens, Global South civil society will have a bigger role to play, more opportunities. I think that in terms of insider and outsider strategies, which is more effective, I don't want to make that call here, but I do think that both are needed. I think that capacity building, technical assistance is needed on the Chinese end. Chinese stakeholders, they come from a environment where, again, China has good labor laws, good environmental impact assessment laws, but just poor implementation. And so I think, that they're just not aware of the need to uphold these kinds of standards in host countries. So I think that kind of capacity building is needed among Chinese stakeholders. But at the same time, you also need communities and CSOs to push them from the outside to engage in campaigns that will hold them accountable and make others aware of the kinds of human rights and environmental impacts that these Chinese investments are having in the Global South. I think CSOs in the Global South, I should also add that they also need to hold their own governments accountable, because their own governments are also often not really as transparent as they could be or as accountable as they could be. They're not always implementing or enforcing the laws on the books. And finally, I wanted to just say that even though civil society, I think, will have a bigger role to play, I think there will be risks. Certainly CSOs have to consider the risks that come with working on BRI, and some of these have to do with the risks that come to working to activism within their host countries. We know some human rights defenders, environmental activists have been harassed or sometimes even detained or killed in some countries. So it certainly is not a risk-free venture. And there's also risks in terms of dealing with Chinese stakeholders as well. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that at the very end. And I think I will just leave it there because I'm really out of time, and I'll just open it up to questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shawn. Maybe you can end the presentation. Perfect. I will now end the recording here before we move to the discussion. Let me just shout out quickly. Shawn mentioned it. if you want to read through the cases that he has talked to us today, you should definitely also look at the first issue of the Global China Pulse, an open access journal Shawn already mentioned, where he has also published on these cases. I'm going to stop the recording now, if I can find it.